Hello and welcome to the Manitoba School Boards Association webinar on change management. My name is Janice Arnold, Board Development Consultant here at the Association. If you're listening to this as a recording, the original air date was September 30th, 2015. Therefore, the interactive questions at the end will be unavailable to you, but you can certainly contact our office if you have any questions later. So we're just going to start off right, and I always like to get to know my audience a little. I've posted 3 questions here that will help me steer the conversation a little bit. You can just put in your answers, whatever you like. These answers are not broadcast except to myself. Others won't see what you are putting in. So if you can please go ahead and take a moment to answer them. I can see that there are a few answers coming in now. I'm just taking a look as the numbers change. And we'll just wait. It looks like there's a couple more people just putting their answers in here. Okay, I think we've got most things there. So we are going to get started. So you'll see the main presentation area coming up there now, and I hope you can hear me okay. For those of you that are just trying a webinar for the first time, you will have heard that I have some music starting at the beginning. It always gives you a chance to adjust your speakers a little bit and make sure that there's no glitches. I will also just state that it's a great idea always to run that test connection link that I sent you at the beginning, so that you have the latest updates from Adobe Connect. And there we go. Hi everybody, glad you could join us. Just a couple of things here. I will be able to answer some questions at the end. So if you look on your screen down at the bottom left hand side, there's a window there and you can type a question in at the bottom. I will answer all questions verbally at the end, so you can post them anytime as we go along. You can post a question, and then at the end I'll allow a couple of minutes to answer or to type in your question as well, and we can go through those one by one. Okay, so I will just move over to this new part here. So, as a school trustee, have you ever felt a bit like the American President Woodrow Wilson, who said, "If you want to make enemies, try to change something"? That line of thinking can, however, be countered by inventor Charles Kettering, who said, "The world hates change, yet it is the only thing that can bring around progress." So whether we choose to change or it chooses us, we're confronted by it all the time. So what matters is whether we grasp it and how we manage it. The fear of what it will bring upon us can be rather daunting, and the fear of the unknown can even be crippling or make you not want to move at all. So think about it, I guess, as a board when you're faced with something as major as, I don't know, changes to busing or school configurations. It can really leave you wanting to avoid the whole matter, which in itself can cause more problems, actually. One solution is to take control of it, or I guess the situation or the decision, before it takes control of you. So preparation, managing the transition, and then reinforcing the change are really key. I'm going to break down this into 3 phases for you to consider. And depending on the complexity of the change or the transition, the amount of time and how in depth you want to work on each area can be different. So the phases are preparation, managing the change, and reinforcement. We'll go through each of these one by one, and I'm going to talk about them, as I said, more in depth. At the end of the webinar, there's a downloadable resource, and you can also find it on the MSBA website under Trustee Education and e-learning. In that section of the webinars, those resources stay up there for some time, and you should be able to pick them up if you've lost track of them, or you can also just contact me later to pick up one of those. There, we'll switch over. As they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So let's look at that. I think there are 3 areas that if you work through them really thoroughly in the first place, you can save a lot of work and headaches actually in the end. So you look at it as a way to save the time if you do a little bit of preparation in the beginning. So the first there is assessing the scope of the change. And as we go through this, I sometimes find it helpful if you think about some really hard concrete examples. Maybe think of a big change like major changes to busing, or maybe a school reconfiguration, if you might have that in mind. So really you want to assess first how big the change actually is. Who does it include? And it might not just be students. Think about all the groups. Is it students and the parents, staff, unions, local government, the media, service clubs, sports or committees within the division? And will the change be gradual or radical? And I'm thinking really radical. I remember hearing a story about, it was one day in 1967 when the whole of Sweden went from driving on the left to the right overnight. Now that's radical. But hopefully some of your changes won't be that bad. So who's going to give the input into the change? Or will it be a unilateral move with changes decided only by the board? So with this, with our system of direct taxation and trustees being elected by the public, not to mention how close the public and parents are to their schools, it's difficult to really make a unilateral change. But if this is the case, you may need to make specific preparation steps when it comes to the second phase, and that's managing the change. You will also need to decide in advance how the input be gathered and by what criteria you're actually going to assess it. So the next part is assessing the readiness of all of those that are actually involved in the change. So really, what is the value system and the background of those affected? What will they view as the most important or the priorities? And how much change, or what's the type and how much resistance that you might expect? How much change is already going on? And is this really the best time to implement that change? So this may not really be under your control, but you can assess whether it's worth the wait. I've also found that more people the more that people experience or are used to change, the more they're actually willing to embrace it. So if you can develop a culture that expects and embraces change in the division and encourage them to accept that it will be continuous in the name of progress, that approach can make the change in general a lot easier. Can you imagine if you're coming forward with an idea and you say, okay, here's the next change, and they look to you and say, okay, we're ready for it, or we were expecting that, and that's what we thought. Creating that culture in the first place, that it's never going to stop and that we are going to keep progressing, is really, really important. And that may be the next change in and of itself, is developing the sense of readiness and a culture of change and progress. And then lastly here, what resources can you tap into? Who are the people that you can call on, and are they the leaders and the ones most closely connected to the change, or the ones that will embrace the change that's put to them? And this may not be your de facto leaders, the official leaders. These might be some of those people within the group who others see as leaders. So what is the structure of the change going to be? Will you have a change management team to oversee the move? And who's going to be in that team? Do you have a budget for it? And maybe it's not only a monetary budget, maybe it's resources budget or people budget. And also, have the people in charge of the change been given the authority that they need to make it happen? So who is their sponsor, or who is championing the move behind them? If it's a change coming from the board, then they should be visible and provide audible support throughout the whole process. People coming in there and just saying, now you're going to change, people, if they're always questioning if this is really a move from the division or from the board, it's going to make it that much harder. So some of these points that I've put here, and there's more of them that are actually included in the change management template that you can download at the end. But it's really about crossing all the T's and dotting the I's. If you have a whole list of some of these things there, it just makes it that much easier. So the managing the change. So now really comes the heavy lifting. I'm going to explore with you these 5 areas for planning and implementing the change, and they are communication and sponsorship. I'll look at those quite in depth. And then there's coaching and training we'll look at quickly, and then resistance. So now the second part here, managing the change. The first part there, the communication and the communication plan. So your plan should include a look at today, or really the current situation, the audiences, and remember there could be several, and key messages. And again, there can also be different messages for different groups. And think about the timing of it as well. Are they all going to be hearing about it at the same time, or are you going to let the first group get started and then the next group comes in, because maybe it's weeks or months after that and you don't want to leave them wondering, is anything ever going to happen? So I had done a webinar earlier on branding and communications, which speaks to these points more in depth, so I'm not going to really elaborate here. But if you would like to take a look at that, there's always recorded versions of these webinars on our website, and the template for a complete communications plan can also be found there. You'll have to excuse me, I'm suffering from a bit of a cold here. So the communication plan, it also needs to address, firstly, the issue, how things stand at present, and why the change is needed. So that's really critically important if you want to create buy-in. There's also messaging about the process that will be used for the change, and the impacts of the change on the people, and perhaps not only the people that you're addressing in the moment, but others that will be affected by the change. What the financial situation is, perhaps that's why you're making the change, or perhaps you're doing it because there's a trend in the education community or your demographics within your division. So communicating all that about why it's actually having to happen. And then perhaps part of creating the buy-in is the consequences if there is no change. Of course, we all need to know that people pick up information in different ways. So depending on the complexity of the information, you may have to consider using different mediums for different audiences. So is it a notice that you send home with your students? Is it communicating at a staff meeting? Is it letting your unions know? Is it letting the public know, the business community? How do you let them know? Is it using social media, Twitter, Facebook, your website? So how often and for how long will you need to be delivering that message before it really sinks in? And then there's whether the message needs to be different for the various audiences. In other words, do their needs differ? It's also a good idea to remain transparent about that too. Even if you're delivering different messages, the emphasis might be on one or the other. And you will need to connect with each audience in a different way that's really meaningful to them. So it's about the messaging, and with that messaging, you want to think about the 4 C's: clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. Something that really, can catch their attention, it's meaningful to them, and they remember it. A long, rambling reason is not going to be something that'll stick with them, and maybe it's not something that they can repeat, but if they can repeat it to others and maybe just to themselves, that's important. So along with those points on style, this might be an opportunity to also start that culture of change, to one of expecting that there will always be change. And it's important to get on board because that's progress, and when this change is done, there will be more on the horizon, and you really don't want to be left behind. That in itself might be part of your message. Now let's try letting your audience know your expectations of them, and that's really a place to create buy-in to any change. So firstly, you might talk about expectations to this new change and include ways to assist you with that. But it's great to talk about the expectations after the change as well. And this next part, this is one I kind of like almost the most, and it's kind of near and dear to my heart. And it's one that I can't stress enough, but you always need to address the question of what's in it for me. And I don't mean what's in it for me, perhaps you as a board member, a superintendent, the division, you really need to look at your audience and answer that question, what's in it for them? That's the me I'm talking about. So if you're thinking about it more in terms of a change about what will make my life easier, it will save me or maybe the division money, it's my pet project, or people need to do this because it's for the good of the students, then you might need to go back to the drawing board. So yes, all of it should be done for, say, the good of the division or the good of the students, but will that really get people to commit? There's lots of things that we should do, but now you need to come up with the reasons why they would want to do it. So if you're looking at that example I said at the beginning, the relocation of students, I don't know, to the other side of the division or the other side of a town, are you really going to entice parents to do it and have to drive their kids and drop them off in the morning just because it's for, it'll make me feel better, it'll save me a lot of headaches? I don't think that's going to win a lot of support for your idea. You have to answer the what's in it for me. Maybe it's a lot of new resources over there that will make their child successful. Something like that. Okay, let's go and look at the next section here on communications plan, and that's the schedule. So while there are some obvious things that you'll cover in the communications plan, don't skip them or gloss them over in their importance of them. So take time to write them down and commit to them yourself. At the very least, these last three here, deliverables, key decisions, and early successes will inspire confidence in the team or in the person that's carrying out the change. So along with the resource that you can download at the end, you could also download the resource with the communications and branding webinar, and both of those could perhaps be a great starting point. So under managing the change, that's the first section here, we'll look quickly at sponsorship next. So by that I mean the authority provided for the change or the sponsorship or championing of the actual initiative. These are important drivers for a successful transition. Sponsorship needs to be visible not only at the beginning, for example, so the board announcing an upcoming change, but throughout the whole process, and even through the initial maintenance or a period otherwise, the initial maintenance period. Otherwise, it starts to look more like, that report that is written and it's approved and then it sits on the shelf. People are going back and taking a look at it, and they need to say, we're going to move ahead with this. We're not going to just flip back and do the things the way that we've always done them. And as well, sponsorship shouldn't be confused with just support. A board or superintendent can and should support the changes, but sponsorship provides authority. It's really active and visible. This includes helping leaders make decisions and steering them to do the right things, or maybe sponsors need to also be ready to pitch in and when a resistance arises. And with perhaps a less developed implementation plan that doesn't really, fully articulate the whys, the drivers, or the motivation, a sponsor's role can really be doubly important. It spurs people on or inspires really the completion of the whole transition. The sponsor needs to have a voice and be someone that everyone that is affected will actually listen to. And then let's look at this, the third and fourth parts of managing the change. These next two are quicker that I'll run through, but they can go a long way to a successful transition. Your change management team can also make up part of your coaching team, those who will continue to work through reinforcing new processes or behaviors. And it's important to recruit leaders that are closest perhaps to those affected, people that they look to. That might be your division staff, the principals, teachers, parent groups, people even in your own community. For the reinforcement phase, the leaders and coaches need to keep that momentum and good intentions so the change doesn't fall by the wayside. So really take the time to create buy-in with them about that change, create a full understanding of the expectations and the reasons for the change, provide ongoing support and resources if needed, and provide training. The training encompasses all of those points as well, And your change management team, with them you can develop training requirements based on their skills, knowledge, behaviors that are all necessary to implement the change. So these requirements will be really the basis for an initial training program for those coaches. And I've saved one of the favorite for last. First of all, you need to accept that resistance is normal. However, it's the ongoing resistance that's something that can perhaps threaten a project. Here, there's really 4 things that come into play. First, did you prepare in advance by fully developing those drivers I talked about, the whys, preparing your motivators and your team? Second, have you included in your communications plan the what's in it for me? By answering that and making sure you're really thinking about it from their point of view, that's important. And make it obvious to all involved. Pockets of resistance can fester and derail change. As those that are resisting, they move around and try to gain support. So really take the time to think this through for each of your audiences and communicate it well and often. And then through training, you can give everyone involved a level of comfort and confidence in the change. It's about all those involved feeling good and, good about their contribution. And last, if you've done your homework before and developed that culture of ongoing change and progress, half your battle is over before you even start. And sometimes that change culture, that can take a while to implement in and of itself. Now, this last part here, and that's there's first the preparation and then the managing change, which I talked 5 points there. Now we're really talking about the reinforcement phase. And that would begin perhaps with an assessment of the activities collected through feedback of those involved. So for less complex changes, this can be as simple as watching and listening, but whatever form it takes, this assessment is necessary for future projects or changes, and if necessary, development of some corrective actions. To reinforce change, celebrating successes is also good, even the small ones throughout the transition. They can be a critical component of the change management. The lead or change team, they may have to actively seek out some of those successes. They might not always be obvious or evident, but arrange to recognize those and recognize the people that are working towards the success. So a big component of having everyone buy into the change is not only celebrating the completion of the change, but celebrate your stakeholders' part in completing it and being part of that new environment. So let's look at this last part again here. To make progress, everything changes all the time, and well-managed change spells success. So take the time to work through all those 3 phases thoroughly, and it should save you a lot of time in the end, rather than thrusting something upon them with no explanation. Again, you're wondering about how to get started. So try the resource I'll show you in a moment on the next screen, along with the one on the communications and branding webinar. And depending on the complexity of your change, you may need to spend some time putting in a lot of detail on those 2 pieces. But can be worth it in the end. I hope it does save you a little bit of time. So we're going to switch over now. I see at least one question has come up there. So if you want to take any time to put in some other questions, you can certainly go ahead. I'll switch over to that in a moment. So as I answer these, you can certainly pose more as we go along, and I'll stay on as long as there are some questions. If you think of something after we've signed off, I've also said you can contact me at the association office. That's 233-1595, or my email is down there at the bottom of this screen that you see now. And you can also find my email on the website, and those resources stay with our recorded webinars. Again, that's under the blue services tab, trustee education and e-learning. So the question I have here that I see here, and if you ask a question as well, it's not displayed there for everyone to see. Don't worry about your typing abilities. Hopefully I can make it out. I will read the question out and then address it as I go along. So this person is asking, if we're going through a large change like the example you gave at the beginning, that, for example, refiguring schools, and a group of parents goes to the media, what would you suggest? Well, I think that the preparation stage is key there. It's very important. And if they're already going to the media, for example, maybe you can backtrack a little bit and go through some of those preparation stages again. But really getting on that right away and making sure that you're ready to react is important. So making sure that your key messages are in place and who your point person or point people are to deliver those messages. Are they staying on point? So transparency is also important right from the beginning. So if you can anticipate really, will there be media coverage in the first place? You might try meeting with the media prior and making sure that they have the correct information right off the hop. Also make sure that the media has your point person's contact information and they make themselves available to answer questions so that both sides of the story are heard. You don't want just one side of it getting out there and leaving everyone in confusion. You also have to realize that people accept change, I guess, at different paces. So with a big change, like if it's a school reconfiguration like you asked about, have you set aside enough time to gather input from those that are going to be affected by the change? Have you really involved them in the decision making? Have you communicated all that needs to be said, throughout? Talking about the outcomes and going on like that. And it's really communicating throughout. I mentioned there the people that have the authority as well, making sure that those people with the authority are really staying involved as well and being seen there as being, they're visible and being part of that. And I'm going back here again to really my favorite point here. It's creating that buy-in and answering the what's in it for me question. That's also important to try to nip it in the bud about, those people going to there and complaining. So if you're perhaps reconfiguring schools and parents are concerned, about their kids being moved to the new school, you need to find out what their biggest worries are. Those are in those initial sort of input gathering phases. It can't be underestimated, and it takes the opportunity to create buy-in. I've also talked at other times about the case. I mentioned it to some school divisions. I remember hearing about it. It was a credit union, and they were going to amalgamate, but they glossed over really the communication and buy-in stage at the beginning. And they ran into such resistance with the amalgamation that, and really the amalgamation, if it didn't happen, they were going to cease to exist. So by not communicating, their membership voted it down. They had to go back to the drawing board, redo everything, and really communicate it. And it wasn't until almost a year later that all the members voted for the amalgamation, because at that point, then they really understood the what's in it for me and what were the consequences of not changing. So really, that was a very long answer there to that one question, but I see that that's my only question up there so far. I'll give it maybe one more minute. As I mentioned, I'll just talk about here. If you'll see in the box on the upper right side, it says Change Management Assessment Plan. It's a PDF. If you click on it to select it, then you can see there it says Download Files. You should be able to download it and print it off from there. And the same would work with the one that I mentioned on communications and branding. Okay, so I don't see any others coming up there. As I said, this is being held in September of 2015. We've started up again for the new school year. We will be having webinars approximately once a month, taking a couple of breaks when we have our big conference, as there are other learning opportunities available, and over the end of the year period there might not be as many. But I hope you will tune in again, and thanks very much for joining